Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology. So today we'll be talking about where we left off. We're on the second half of chapter 2, and we're going over macromolecules. So to start, when we talk about macromolecules, it's like, all right, it's this big word. What does it mean exactly? So think about it. When you have something that you're eating, if you look at the dietary portion of it, like if you look at the back of your label, it'll have the macros or the macromolecules broken down for you. So they'll tell you how many proteins are in that food, how many carbs are in that food, and how many fats are in that food. Because we don't eat nucleic acids, that's usually left off. But the fourth macromolecule are our nucleic acids. So our macromolecules are what we need as humans to survive. If we don't consume them, um, we just don't do well. We don't thrive. And if you don't thrive, you are dying, right? So the macromolecules that we will talk about, again, there are four of them, and they are carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and our lipids. Another word for lipids are fats. So we'll start with our carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are very important. I mean, they're all very important, but carbs specifically are important because of this guy right here, glucose. Glucose is super important to us because the end goal for everything that we eat is to break it down into glucose, which is a simple sugar, and glucose is then broken down into adenosine triphosphate, which is called ATP. ATP is literally the currency or the fuel source for our cells. Okay, so again, glucose is the simplest carbohydrate, and it is what we use. The end game for our bodies is to create glucose, is to break down the molecules into glucose. And from there, glucose is broken down into ATP, which is also called adenosine triphosphate. And that is what we use to fuel our cells. Okay, so you're probably noticing here monosaccharides. Monosaccharides is a fancy way of saying carbohydrates. Okay, so when we talk about our macromolecules, we talk about monomers and polymers. So in Latin, mono, M-O-N-O, equals one. So it's saying a monomer is just saying that there is one unit of that thing. So the monomers are the building blocks of all of our macromolecules. In the case of carbohydrates, the monomer for a carbohydrate is a mono, so one saccharide. A monosaccharide is the building block for carbohydrates. So if I tell you that I have a monosaccharide, that means I'm telling you that I have one saccharide, and I'm probably talking about glucose. Okay. If I say that there are two saccharides, we're going to use the Latin term, which would be disaccharides. Di, the prefix di stands for two. If I say we have a trisaccharide, tri, that means that I have three. So mono is one, di is two, tri is three. And then saccharide will always tell you that it belongs in the carbohydrate family. Okay. A saccharide will never refer to a protein, it will never refer to a fat, and it will never refer to a nucleic acid. Okay. So monosaccharides are carbohydrates. Okay. So glucose, I said before, is just, that's our most important, most treasured carbohydrate, because that is the end goal for everything that we eat, is to break it down into glucose for our energy. Okay, some other important monosaccharides here, we have fructose, galactose, okay? And these are all hexoses, meaning that they have five sides in their structure. Okay, down here we see deoxyribose and ribose. These are also sugars, and these sugars are found in DNA, in nucleic acids. So deoxyribose is found in DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. So these are the sugars that are attached to the nucleic acids that form those. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about some disaccharides. Remember we mentioned the prefix di means two. So these are carbs that are pairs that are linked together in two. So we have sucrose, which is table sugar. We have lactose, which is the sugar that we find in milk and milk products. And then we have maltose, which is another type of sugar as well. Okay, so sucrose, lactose, and maltose are disaccharides. So these are sugars that are in pairs. Okay, so they are chained together and are formed by a dehydration synthesis reaction. Remember we talked about synthesis, that was a simple A plus B equals AB reaction. So synthesis means that these two just got together, they linked together, and in their linking, they dehydrated. So when we talk about dehydration, we talk about we think about how water is lost, right? We remove the water. So what happened when these molecules got together is that they linked together, and in the process, they lost a water molecule. And that's why they mentioned the dehydration portion. Is that vital for us to know? Not necessarily. But what I do want you guys to know is that sucrose, lactose, and maltose are all examples of disaccharides, okay? Meaning that they are two sugars linked together, okay? Again, lactose is found in milk products. And those of us who are lactose intolerant, that just means that we have a hard time breaking down this sugar. So our body is struggling to break down this sugar because we don't have the proper enzyme or enough of the enzyme lactase to break it down. So that's when we get all of those symptoms such as stomach cramps, gassiness, some of us have diarrhea, it's a mess. So lactose is what those of you who suffer with that are going through. Okay, so let us keep going. So again, let's go back to do a quick review. Our monomer for a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. Now, if you add any more to that, then we move into disaccharides, and then any more than two, when we're talking about carbohydrates, are just going to call them poly, which means many saccharides. Okay, let's keep going. One moment. Okay, so now let's move on. Let's move on to different polysaccharides. Remember we said that poly meant many, okay? So polysaccharides are types of carbs that have many monosaccharides linked together. Ones that are important for us are going to be the starches, and then we have glycogen and cellulose. So glycogen is very important for us because when we have too many sugars or excess sugar, our body is going to be like, I'm not going to throw this away. I'm not going to waste it. What can I do with it? Oh, I know, I'll package it for when we need it later. So our body stores glucose as glycogen, okay? Glycogen is usually stored in our liver for when we need it. So in times when we don't have access to food, our bodies are just not going to shut down. They're going to use our glycogen reserves, which are our stored glucose, for us to function, okay? So glycogen are our stored glucose reserves. Starches are how plants save their glucose. So starches that we normally know that are found in like potatoes and things of that nature, those are sugars that are stored in plants. That's how plants store their sugars. Cellulose are the fibers that give the plants their shape. Cellulose is great for us because because okay, so cellulose is how the plants keep their shape. So cellulose is really important to us because that is how we get our roughage. Roughage is important for us because that's like things like salad and spinach and broccoli, all of those fibers, we aren't able to break them down, but what they do is that they give our digestive tract a nice sweep. If our bodies don't get enough fiber, we have a hard time, we make it extra hard for our digestive system to remove wastes, which is why we always talk about how it's important to have a certain amount of fiber in your diet. Okay, so fiber is a type of polysaccharide that is found in plants, and it's important to us because our bodies are unable to break them down completely. So they stimulate our digestive tract and help our digestive tract move along. So it helps us to get rid of our waste. Okay, like I said, glycogen is important because that is the way our bodies store glucose for times of need. And then starches are how plants save their sugars for times of need, and we just ingest those. Those are found in things like potatoes and things of that nature. Let's keep going. Okay, so we talked about carbs, right? Now let us talk about lipids. Lipids are another word for fat. And when we talk about lipids, there are different types. There are triglycerides, which we'll talk about shortly. We also have steroids, and we also have phospholipids, which we'll all talk about. So let's start off with triglycerides. Okay, when we talk about triglycerides, the shape always comes into the conversation. Okay, so triglyceride has a glycerol at its core, and this is glycerol. And then it has a 3-chain fatty acid tail, is how they describe it. Okay, so again, a triglyceride has a glycerol at its core, and then 3 fatty acid chains. So triglycerides are just fats, as we normally call them, are important. Well, they're all important, but this is important because when we talk about saturated versus unsaturated fat, this is what we're referring to, the triglycerides themselves. So these are important because saturated fats typically come um, from our animal products. Okay, so these are saturated fats. What they're talking about is the structure of, these are carbons here in the center, and then they have the hydrogens holding on to each carbon. If you look at a saturated fat, it is just straight across, straight across. It's not flexible at all. If you compare that to an unsaturated fat, where here there is a carbon-carbon bond, double bond, which causes a kink in the molecule and allows this to be more flexible. In our daily lives, this is important because saturated fats typically are from animal byproducts, and unsaturated fats are typically plant-derived. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, when we're talking about our diet and what we eat, it's best to have a plant-based diet for this reason here, because of the oils that we're going to get from the plants, such as like avocado oil or let me see, olive oil. The different types of oils that we use to cook are better than, let's say, lard or animal fat, because at room temperature, saturated fat is solid. Think about lard, it's a hard rock. Saturated fats are liquid at room temperature. That matters because if we get to a point where our arteries start to become clogged, it matters who is more likely to clog your artery? Is it going to be something that is inflexible and that is solid at room temperature? Or will it likely to be clogged by something that is flexible and is liquid at room temperature? The answer is saturated fats. Saturated fats are what are more likely to cause us harm and cause us atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is just a way of saying clogged arteries. Okay. Clogged arteries are not good because that impedes our blood flow, which we'll talk about later in the cardiovascular chapters. Okay. So again, we are talking about lipids. We said that one of the type of lipids are triglycerides. When we talk about triglycerides, we talk about their shape. So you can either be saturated, which is usually animal derived, and it is solid at room temperature. It's very rigid, it's inflexible. We don't like that. Then we have unsaturated fats. Unsaturated fats are usually plant derived. They have this carbon carbon double bond, which causes a kink in it and allows for flexibility. We like that. And it is solid at room temperature. We like that because, it is liquid at room temperature. And we like that because it allows for movement and it's less likely to cause atherosclerosis. Okay. Now we will move into our phospholipids. Phospholipids are one of my favorites because we talk so much about this in the upcoming chapter. Phospholipids are composed of two fatty acids, a glycerol, and a phosphate group. What I want you to look at is this molecule here. It looks like a sphere with two tails. Phospholipids are what make up the cell membrane. The cell membrane is the outer envelope that keeps all of the machinery and all the good stuff of the cell within the cell. So the phospholipid are what create like a safe environment for all that's within the cell, which is why I love phospholipids so much. Okay, so phospholipids, they have a polar head and non-polar tails. Another way of saying this is that they have a hydrophilic, hydrophobic head and hydrophilic tails. We spoke about hydrophobic versus hydrophilic last class. Hydrophobic means that it does not like water. And then we said that hydrophilic means that it enjoys water. Water is good. Okay, so water loving. Okay, so again, the major point that I want you to remember here is that phospholipids are part of the cell membrane. They make up a large part of the cell membrane. So if I were to ask you, what is a major component of the cell membrane? And I said, is it a phospholipid? Is it a steroid? Is it glucose, maltose, or sucrose? You would tell me phospholipids, and you'd be right. Okay. Another type of lipid is our sterols or steroids. Okay, so we've heard of steroids before. Usually we hear about them in the mainstream when we're talking about athletes who are using steroids to grow their muscles. But steroids are more than that. Yes, anabolic steroids such as testosterone matter, but also estrogen are steroids. And we have so many other different types of steroids that we have in our body, which we'll talk about later. But steroids are really, really, really important. They act as messengers between organs and organ systems within our bodies. Think about, and they come from fat. So one of the common causes of women not having regular menstrual cycles is anorexia. So if somebody has very low body weight, they don't have any excess fat. If you don't have any excess fat, you do not have steroids. The steroids are what create our hormones. So if you do not have the hormone signaling mechanisms going, functioning properly, then you will not have a menses as a woman. Steroids are also important in men. Steroids are what give men their typical, quote, masculine features, such as body hair and height, weight, how dense they are, and all of that good stuff. So steroids are also important, and they are also a type of lipid. Let's see what we have next. Okay, next, let's move on to amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. Okay, so remember we talked about monomers and polymers. So the monomer for a protein is an amino acid. Amino acids are held together by peptide bonds. Okay, a quick fact for you: if something has PEP in the word in it, that is referring to a protein and usually an enzyme, because all enzymes are proteins. Okay. And we spoke about enzymes before, but we'll talk about it again in a second. Okay. Yes, like I said, all proteins are held together by, all amino acids, are held together by peptide bonds. Those peptide bonds and a bunch of amino acids get together and form a protein. Okay. And they are also held together by a dehydration synthesis reaction, which is our A plus B equals AB reaction. Just a really straightforward reaction. Okay, so let's talk about the shapes of protein. The shapes of proteins are super important. Okay, so there are 4 levels of protein organization. Okay, I'll repeat that again. There are 4 levels of protein organization. We have the primary structure, and that is where the amino acids are just in a straight line, one behind the other, held by peptide bonds between them. Okay, they are all just amino acid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just all in a line, one after the other, just a straight line. Nothing special, nothing to write home about. Then when we move on to the secondary structure, things get a little fancy. So now there are so many amino acids that are together and so many peptide bonds happening that they start to form a sheet. So think about if you have a piece of paper and you fold it several times, it becomes like this, a sheet. So it's still two-dimensional like a piece of paper is, but it has these folds in them, okay? And they call those beta pleated sheets as the secondary structure, okay? It can also have an alpha helix, which is where they're kind of in a slightly spiral orientation, okay? So to go back, we have our primary structure, which is just straight line, straight across, nothing fancy, a bunch of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. Then our secondary structure, we have that there are so many more peptide bonds and so many more amino acids that they start to fold as in a sheet. Okay, that's our beta pleated sheet. Another secondary structure can be the alpha helix, where they start to intertwine and wind as if they are a spiral staircase. Okay. Now let's move on to the tertiary structure. Now there are just so many amino acids that it starts to crumble up, takes a 3D-dimensional structure, it starts to become a 3D-dimensional structure, almost as if you took a piece of paper and you crumbled it. So you went from a sheet of paper that you folded in the secondary structure to a piece of paper that you took and you just balled it up into your tertiary structure. Now, your quaternary structure is where you take that piece of paper and you really condense it into like a really tight ball, and that is your quaternary structure. An example of this is showing the hemoglobin protein, which is what carries our red blood cells, it carries our oxygen. Okay. This is important, so please take note. We have our primary structure, our secondary structure, our tertiary structure, and then our quaternary structure, okay? Primary is just easy peasy, nothing to talk about. It's all in a straight line, a bunch of amino acids, one behind the other, linked together by our peptide bonds. Our secondary structure is where it starts to get a little bit fancy. We have either the beta pleated sheet, and that is where it starts to take on more shape by looking like a piece of paper that you folded over and over again, okay? Or it can be an alpha helix, which is pretty much like a staircase, a spiral staircase. Our tertiary structure is where there are so many amino acids and so many peptide bonds that now it's like you took that a piece of paper and you just started to crumble it. Okay, so now you have like a 3D ball. And your quaternary structure is where now it is just solid. There are so many amino acids, so many peptide bonds happening, so many bonds happening that now it is just a solid mass of proteins. Okay. And let's talk about our enzyme. We talked about enzymes before, really briefly, the beginning of this chapter. Let's talk about them a little bit more. Enzymes make the world go round. There are literally thousands of chemical reactions happening inside our bodies right now as we speak. And if we did not have enzymes to make those things happen, we just wouldn't survive, because it would take so much energy and so much time that it just wouldn't be efficient. So the creator, being as efficient as he or she is, decided, you know what, let's make an enzyme to make these things happen way quicker. So an enzyme is always a protein. An enzyme is a protein. An enzyme will never be a carb. It will never be a nucleic acid. It will never be a fat. An enzyme is a type of protein which acts on specific substrates or specific areas to do specific things. Remember we talked about lactose, and those of us who are lactose intolerant have a hard time breaking down that type of sugar, which is usually found in dairy products, right? And I said that the reason that we have a hard time breaking it down is because we are deficient in an enzyme called lactase. Okay, so lactase is a type of enzyme that helps our bodies to break down the sugar molecule that is lactose. Okay, so enzymes are proteins that can work with different proteins, or they can act on carbohydrates. They can act on, They can act on carbohydrates, they can act on fats, they can act on nucleic acids, they can act on anything. However, they are always going to be proteins. Please remember that. Okay, and they act on very specific molecules to get what they need to get done. So for example, one of my favorite models of enzymes is called the lock and key model, which means that I have a key, you have a key to your house, I have a key to my house. We all have keys, right? But just because you have a key to your house does not mean that that key is going to work at my house too. The keys are very specific to the door that they are created for, or the knob that they are created for. Okay, so the same way with enzymes. Just because I have enzyme A here and I have substrate, and a substrate is what the enzyme works on, and I have a substrate here, does not mean that this enzyme is going to work on that substrate. Okay. For example, lactose needs lactase for it to be broken down. It needs that specific enzyme for it to work on it in order for it to be broken down properly. Let's see. Did I get everything there? I think I did. Okay, and now we will talk about our last group of macromolecules, which are our nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are either going to be DNA or RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. Okay? DNA is important because it is the building block of it contains all the genetic information that makes us us. Okay. Although we are more alike than we are different, we all have very specific differences that make us ourselves. Okay. And that all is housed in our DNA. Okay. So they both so their monomers for the nucleic acids are the nucleotides. Okay. So the building blocks of all nucleotides are one or more phosphate groups, a pentose sugar, and a nitrogen containing base. The nitrogen containing bases of nucleotides are going to be these up here, okay? So we have cytosine, thymine, uracil, adenine, and guanine, okay? So the nitrogen containing bases of nucleotides are these 5 here, okay? They further separate them into 2 different categories. So they could either be pyrimidines or purines. The pyrimidines are cytosine, thymine, and uracil. If you notice, thymine is specific to DNA and uracil is specific to RNA. Okay, so our pyrimidines are cytosine, thymine, and uracil. Purines are going to be adenine and guanine. Okay. So why does this matter? Because when we talk about the bases in DNA, they all match up with each other. Adenine is always going to pair off with thymine. Guanine is always going to pair up with cytosine. Okay. A goes with T, G goes with C. Okay. The pairs are always going to be the same. So adenine is always going to be with thymine, and guanine is always going to be with cytosine. If for some reason, if this is a DNA, if this is RNA, it would be a single strand. It's not double stranded. It would be a single strand. And adenine would pair with uracil. Remember, thymine is specific to DNA. And instead of thymine, RNA has uracil, okay? So when we talk about the differences between DNA and RNA, we have a couple things. DNA is a double helix, so it has 2 strands, whereas RNA is a single helix. It has 1 strand, it's one-stranded. They both have nitrogenous bases. However, RNA has uracil instead of thymine, and then the other way around for DNA, okay? DNA houses all of the information for our genetic information, and yes, let's see what else. Let me look at let me just make sure, 1 moment. Okay, remember we talked about ATP earlier in this lecture. I said that what is so important about glucose is that our body's end goal is to break everything down that we eat into our bodies into glucose, and then glucose is then broken down into ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, which is the fuel that our bodies use pretty much. ATP is what we use for energy. Okay. So ATP is adenosine triphosphates. Remember, tri means 3. So there are 3 phosphates and adenine together, and a ribose sugar. Okay. So the end goal for everything is ATP. Let's do a quick, I wanted to mention that in our fat section, where is it over here? Another important part about our fats is that while most of our vitamins and minerals are water soluble, meaning that they can be dissolved in water, and we are mostly water, We have 4 vitamins that are fat soluble. And that is very important because if we are deficient in fat, then our bodies aren't able to absorb them. So we need fat to absorb those vitamins. And they are vitamins A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. So vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat soluble vitamins. So going back to our example of a person who is suffering from anorexia, a person suffering from anorexia typically has very low body fat. So if they have low body fat, you can also assume that not only are they going to have hormonal deficiencies, but they'll also have deficiencies of vitamins A, D, E, and K because they do not have the proper amount of body fat to absorb those things. Okay, so that is all we have for chapter 2. We will be getting together tomorrow and we will start chapter 3, which is all on the cell. Okay, so that completes today's lesson. Have a good one.